Hi guys, welcome to section B. We're going to cover the nervous system for section B. So buckle up, there's lots to talk about, all right? So main function, and we kind of talk about it in three main steps, okay? First, your nervous system receives stimulus, okay? Mostly from our five senses. It gets more complicated than that, but you see, touch, smell, hear, whatever. So all of that sensory information coming in is the first step. Your nervous system is receiving that information. But then it has to know what to do with that information. Okay, it has to interpret it and identify it. Our eyes can see like 7 million different colors, different shades, different tones, and upwards of 1 trillion different smells. This is wild. Okay, and yet we can identify so many things really without even thinking about it. This is how powerful our nervous system is. So receive, interpret, and then respond to that information. What are we going to do with it? Okay, is it a good smell? Is it a bad smell? Does it hurt? Do I need to remove myself? What do I say? How do I move? All these things, and so much of this happens without our conscious thought. This information that we're talking about is transmitted through our nervous system by electrical impulses, basically. And they travel through our nervous system at 180 miles per hour. So when you touch something, and that information literally goes through your arm, up your spinal cord to your brain, and then responds back to your arm, that's traveling at 180 miles per hour. That's why you can respond so quickly. Now, there's a fourth part of the function that's kind of separate. It's still very important, but it's maintaining homeostasis. Okay, when you feel thirsty, that's your nervous system telling you that your body needs water. Things like that. When you have to go to the bathroom, and so some of what our nervous system is doing is giving us signals to know how to maintain a balance in our body. Okay, but these three are really the ones that we're going to talk most about. Okay. Your nervous system is divided into two main divisions. We've got the central nervous system, which is just the purple in that diagram. It's your brain and your spinal cord. Okay, it controls everything. And then there's the peripheral nervous system. Your peripheral vision is like your side vision, and so your peripheral nervous system is what branches off of the central nervous system. And that's what it is. It's all the nerves that branch off. You've got cranial nerves that we'll talk about in section C, that branch directly off of the brain, but then all the rest of these nerves branch off of the spinal cord. Now, your peripheral nervous system kind of branches again, and it deals with voluntary functions and involuntary systems, but we're just going to talk about these two divisions. Okay. So what are the functional units, right? So we've got these neurons, which are individual cells in our nervous system, and they are what carries the impulses. Okay, if you look on page 331, you can see a picture of a neuron. There's a picture right here, and you do need to know some of these parts. Okay, a dendrite, this is like the receiving end of the cell. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of dendrites here, and they are receiving an impulse from somewhere else. Okay, and it carries the impulse in this direction, okay, towards the cell body, first of all, which is the kind of the main part. There is a nucleus. These are cells. The axon then is this large tail that comes off of the cell body, and that carries the impulse away from the cell body. Now this looks like dendrites, but since it's at the end of the axon and the impulse is going to keep going that way, it actually has a different name. Those are called axon terminals. Okay, the gap, and then you would have another neuron over here that this would be connecting with. The gap between the axon tip of one neuron and a dendrite of another is called a synapse. Okay. Now, nerves, we talk about nerves all the time. Nerves are like collections of neurons. We talk about these nerve fibers, and it's like a whole bunch of axons kind of lined up. And there's multiple neurons, and they just kind of work together in these nerve fibers. Okay. So here is a synapse. Let me move myself up here. This is the gap, okay? So our impulse is moving this way. Pin again. Okay, so you've got the axon tip of one cell and then the dendrites of another, and you get this little gap right there. That's a synaptic, a synapse. That's just the gap there. Okay, so the impulse has to get from one neuron to the other, and it does that by transmitting chemicals. Okay, so these are electrical signals that get sent, and since some of the chemicals in our bodies can have positive and negative charges, that's how it's carried. So the axon tip will release these chemicals across the gap, and they'll be taken up by the dendrites of another neuron. Those are called neurotransmitters, all right? And you've probably heard of some of those before: dopamine, serotonin. Those are some really common ones. There's a lot of medications that can be used to treat things like anxiety, depression, even ADD can be treated with some neurotransmitter type medications. Okay, some of those medications will add neurotransmitters. Some will block the release of neurotransmitters. Some will block the uptake of the neurotransmitters. So there's lots of different types of medication that can add to or prevent some of those neurotransmitters carrying those signals across. Okay. All right, let me get myself back down here. This is the closest thing we have to a pathway in the nervous system. We've got 3 different types of neurons. Okay. So a sensory neuron, that's what's receiving the information. When you touch something hot, or you shake somebody's hand, or you know, feel something sharp, whatever it is, it doesn't have to all be pain. Whatever you're receiving, that's received by sensory neurons. And it carries the information then towards these interneurons, which are in your spinal cord and your brain. Okay. That's where the interpretation is going to take place. What do I do with this information? Then it comes back, and then there's special neurons called motor neurons, which will give the response. Oftentimes it's going into our muscles and it's telling us how to move or what to do. Okay. So sensory neuron, interneuron, and motor neuron. All right, now let's talk about the brain. It's pretty important. Okay. There's actually different divisions of the brain, like the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe. I'm not going to quiz you guys on those. Okay. There are 3 parts of the brain, though, that I want you to know. But first, just talk about the brain in general. 100 billion neurons make up the brain. And there's this stuff called gray matter and white matter, and it has different functions, and it's going to get way more complicated than we are learning right now. But it's a really interesting organ, really cool. It's covered by this really tough membrane known as the meninges to help protect it. And it's surrounded by something called cerebrospinal fluid. So this is a fluid that the brain kind of floats in, and that fluid covers the spinal cord as well. If anybody has ever had a spinal tap, what they do is they stick an injection, they stick a needle into your back, and they remove some of that cerebrospinal fluid to run different tests. One thing they're looking for is a disease called meningitis. Okay, maybe you've heard of that, and that's an infection of the meninges. Okay, or an infection of the cerebrospinal fluid. We don't need to worry about that, though. Okay, so just lots of stuff going on. Remember, I told you sometimes if you get dehydrated, you get a headache. It's because that cerebrospinal fluid amount goes down, and the brain kind of settles on the base of your skull, and your body's like, "Hey, I need more water." That's the nervous system maintaining that water balance. Okay. All right. Here's the 3 main parts. The cerebrum is the main part. That's the squiggly part. That's this whole top section right here. Okay, the cerebrum, and it is divided into these lobes. Like I said, I'm not going to quiz you on those though. And this is our thinking. This is speech. This is the interpretation of things. Most of our functions of the brain take place in the cerebrum. Okay. But then we also have this guy in the back here, down at the base of our brains, called the cerebellum. And that is responsible for coordination and balance. Okay. all of our speech and memory and thinking and language is this front part. This guy back here is balance and coordination. And then finally, we've got this right here, which ultimately leads into the spinal cord, and that's called the brainstem. The brainstem is what regulates your breathing rate, your heart rate, helps you swallow, things like that. So if somebody sustains an injury to their brainstem, some of these functions that are vital for life are interrupted, and that can be deadly. Okay, the brainstem, like I said, then feeds right into the spinal cord. Okay, so let's talk about the spinal cord. There are 31 pairs of nerves coming off of the spinal cord, and they feed in between those individual vertebrae. Okay, and they're pairs because they go to the right side and the left side of the body. Okay. The vertebral column protects the spinal cord inside, but it kind of protects those nerves coming off the side as well. The spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. The nerves coming off of the spinal cord are part of the peripheral nervous system. And that spinal cord is also surrounded by the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. So you've probably heard about spinal cord injuries. There's different kinds. There's complete versus incomplete. Paraplegic versus quadriplegic. Okay. So what happens is the spinal cord has to be intact for the impulses to get to the nerves coming off of it. Okay. So if somebody sustains an injury, say right here, they break their back and they have a complete injury to their spinal cord, the nerve impulse gets stopped right there. That means everything below it, any of the nerves coming off the spinal cord below that, are not going to get that nerve impulse from the brain. Okay. An incomplete injury, even if it's most of the way, if there's still a little bit of the spinal cord intact, the impulse can get around it. Okay. If somebody is a quadriplegic, that means they have sustained an injury up high in their neck, because then the nerves that control the arms and the nerves that control the legs have been affected. They can't move their arms or their legs, so they're a quadriplegic, all four limbs. Okay. If the injury is down lower, okay, like even this one, my pen again, this one that I initially drew, or anything down here, you still have function from all those nerves, and so you can still actually move your arms, and that person would be known as a paraplegic. Okay. Reflexes. So we talked about the inner neurons being in the spinal cord and in the brain. Okay, so you have some ability in your spinal cord to interpret some of that sensory input. Okay, sometimes we need to do things even faster than that impulse getting all the way to our brain and back. Okay, so a reflex is something that happens even faster. It's automatic. It's without even our conscious control. Okay, and we have this thing called a reflex arc, and it's basically the sensory input comes in, goes to our spinal cord, gets interpreted right away, and comes back and has a response even before it gets to our brain. Okay. A lot of our pain responses are because of this, because the faster you can respond to pain, the less damage is going to be done. Okay. When somebody like claps in front of you or whatever, your eyes blinking is actually a reflex. This happens before you actually know that you're in pain. By the time you realize you burned yourself, you've already pulled your hand away from it. Okay. That nerve impulse does still go to your brain. And then that's when you feel the pain. But the reflex arc skips the brain, and it tells you your muscles to remove themselves from the object right away. Kind of cool. Also pointing towards the amazing creator that God is, to give us a nervous system that can protect us like that so quickly. All right, last thing we got to talk about is concussions. Okay, your brain is super fragile, super important. You guys need to protect it. Okay. A concussion is basically a bruise of your brain, and you can get it in different ways. You can get it by getting hit in the head. You can get it by what's known as a deceleration injury. So if you're in a car accident and you have your seatbelt on and you stop really quickly, your brain actually keeps moving forward. So it is possible to get a concussion without actually getting hit. And then we have blast injuries. If some like soldiers that are in explosions, the shock wave can cause a concussion and can cause quite a bit of trauma to the brain. Okay. Some of the common symptoms are headache, nausea, dizziness, blacking out. Pretty much, if you black out, you're just about guaranteed that you had a concussion. Um, the headache might last for weeks. You might be kind of tired, kind of confused, just kind of out of it. Typically, when somebody is suspected of having a concussion, the doctors will instruct the parents to wake the person up, every few hours to make sure they haven't like slipped into a coma. Make sure you still can wake them up. If you throw up after having a head injury, you should definitely go to the hospital and just get checked out. Okay, because in addition to the concussion itself, if there's bleeding going on in the brain, that can be very dangerous. Okay, so take it seriously. And the absolute biggest thing you can do to protect yourself is wear a helmet. I had a student get hit by a car on the way to school once, and broke the guy's windshield. The police officer basically said if he wasn't wearing a helmet, Mr. T drove over to where this happened and like helped out because it was really close to the school. The police officer said if he hadn't been wearing a helmet, this would have been a much different situation. So wear your helmets. All right.